plays pawn to d4, and black responds with the surprising pawn to e5. At first glance, it looks like a blunder, as if black is giving up a pawn for nothing, and white should simply capture it. However, black has a plan in mind. After knight to c6, black immediately attacks the center pawn. White naturally defends it with knight to f3, but then black continues with queen to a7, putting pressure on the same pawn again. The most logical move for white is to defend the center once more with bishop to f4. Up to this point, it seems like white is doing great. A clean extra pawn and a solid position. But now comes black's tricky counterattack. Queen to b4. This move creates a triple attack, threatening the king, the bishop on f4, and the pawn on b2. The best way for white to deal with this is by playing bishop to d2, which covers the check and defends everything safely. Now black's queen captures on b2, attacking white's rook on a 1, and this is the moment of truth. Most players using white who are unfamiliar with this trap will instinctively play bishop to c3. It looks perfect, attacking the queen, defending the rook, and gaining tempo, but it actually walks right into black's deadly idea. Here comes bishop to b4, pinning white's bishop to the queen. Because of this pin, the bishop on c3 can no longer capture the queen, and now white must somehow defend. Meanwhile, the rook on a 1 is still hanging. If white plays bishop takes b4, black simply recaptures. And now, not only is the rook still under attack on a 1, but black is also threatening knight takes c2, which would almost lead to checkmate, attacking both the king and the rook once again. White quickly becomes overwhelmed and completely crushed in just 7 moves. So this is exactly the kind of position you must avoid when facing the England Gambit. Alright, first things first. We already know that to defend the rook on a 1, you should not play bishop to c3 because that move walks straight into black's trap after bishop to b4. Instead, the correct move is knight to c3. This way, your queen now defends the rook on a 1, and at the same time, you're developing another piece, which is always a good thing in chess. From here, black has 2 main ways to continue the attack. The first option is knight to b4, trying to push the idea of knight takes c2, which would attack both the king and the rook. The second option is bishop to b4, increasing pressure along the diagonal. We'll start by looking at the main line, bishop to b4. Even though the position may still feel slightly uncomfortable for white, since there's a threat of bishop takes c3 and the rook on a 1 remains a bit exposed, it's currently well defended and white is still completely fine. Anyway, even though white's position might look a bit shaky, the best move here is rook to b1. This serves 2 purposes. It immediately counterattacks black's queen, and it also means you no longer have to worry about your rook on a 1 being under attack. Now the queen has only 1 safe square left, queen to a 3. At this point, most players would simply defend their knight on c3 and continue developing normally. But instead, I recommend fighting back actively. Since black started this unsound attack, it shouldn't work, and it doesn't. The best response is to go aggressive with knight to d5. This move not only defends your knight on c3, but also creates a strong counterattack on pawn c7, threatening a fork against black's king and rook. On top of that, the bishop on b4 is now hanging too. Because of this, bishop takes d2 is more or less forced, and after that, queen recaptures on d2. Black might try one last trick, queen takes a 2, again attacking your rook, but you can calmly bring it to safety and improve your position with rook to d1, bringing it to the center of the board and completing your development with a winning position. Now black's attack is completely over. They have nothing left. They still have to deal with the threat of knight takes c7, which would fork the king and the rook. Of course, a bold player using this risky opening might try king to d8, but that's not the end of the story. You won't let them escape so easily, because now you prepare another fork with knight to g5, this time threatening the pawn on f7, which again would fork the king and the rook. At this point, black is totally overwhelmed. Their king is exposed in the center of the board, and you have multiple powerful attacking ideas. To defend the pawn on f7, one option for black is to capture your pawn on e5, which also helps protect f7. But then you strike back with queen to c3, creating multiple threats all across the board. Now you're threatening queen takes c7 check, and at the same time attacking the knight on a 5. That knight can't move, it must keep defending the pawn on f7, and your queen is also x-raying through the diagonal, adding even more pressure. You can really see how much trouble black is in here. One possible way for black to respond is by playing pawn to f6, which both defends the knight on a 5 and attacks your knight on g5. But here comes an absolutely brilliant finish. Not easy to spot in a real game. The position is sharp and full of tactics, but if you know this pattern, you'll crush it in just a few moves. You play knight to a 6 check, a classic tactical idea. Since the black king is stuck in the center, your goal is to open the d file, where your rook is already lined up. After pawn takes a 6, you simply continue with queen takes c7 check, forcing the king to move, and from here, black's position completely collapses. Now, of course, we'd love to deliver rook to d8 checkmate, but the knight on f6 is blocking the way. So we simply sacrifice it. Knight takes f6, and after knight recaptures, here comes rook to d8 checkmate. A beautiful and clean refutation of black's tricky gambit. After knight to g5, threatening knight takes f7, besides knight takes e5, which we already covered. Black has another defensive try, knight to h6, guarding the pawn on f7. But even here, white has a brilliant reply, quite similar to the previous line. The idea remains the same. Open up the d file and expose the black king. You start with pawn to a6, aiming to remove the pawn on f7's defender. Black may capture, but you don't hesitate. You sacrifice your knight. After pawn recaptures, your mission is complete. The d file is now open. While you could immediately attack the black king, there's an even stronger move. Simply retreat your knight. This creates a discovered attack on the black queen because it's a check to the king, forcing it to move, and then you capture the queen, continuing your attack with a winning position. So once again, this position is completely winning for white. We've already covered black's main idea, bishop to b4, attacking along the diagonal. But there's also a second attempt, knight to b4, hoping you'll overlook the threat of knight takes c2, which would fork your king and rook. Of course, you shouldn't allow that. The right move is knight to d4, which defends the pawn on c2. But black doesn't give up easily. They continue with pawn to c5, trying to chase your knight away so they can still execute the knight takes c2 fork. So what should you do here? The key move is rook to b1, a very useful intermediate move. It kicks away black's queen and also means you no longer have to worry about defending your rook on a 1. Once the queen moves, you can follow up with knight to b5, not only escaping the attack, but turning the tables completely. Now, you're counter-attacking the queen and threatening knight to c7, which would fork the king and the rook. The hunter becomes the hunted. The queen must retreat to a5, and black's attacking power is gone. Now, focusing on the square on c7, you continue with pawn to a 3. At first, everything seems perfect. You're attacking, gaining space, and it looks like you're just a move or two away from an easy win. Normally, if the knight moves back, you can play knight to d5, creating a discovered attack and preparing knight to c7 next, which would be completely winning since both of your knights support that square. However, since black is playing this tricky gambit, they have one last resource, pawn to a 6. This suddenly complicates things a bit. Sure, you can capture the knight on b4, and after black recaptures, the position becomes somewhat chaotic. It's not immediately obvious how white should coordinate all the pieces, because black is now attacking several of them at once. In this position, you play rook to a 1, attacking the queen while also activating your rook along the a file. The queen retreats to b6, but notice that the a6 pawn can't capture your knight on b5, since it's pinned to the rook. Now comes knight to d5, once again attacking the queen. After queen takes on b5, you deliver a devastating knight to c7, creating a royal fork, attacking the king, queen, and rook simultaneously, firmly securing a winning position. Thanks for watching.